The footprints appeared in the snow on a Tuesday morning, leading from the forest to the front door of the Hinterkaifeck farm. Andreas Gruber pointed them out to his neighbor. There were footprints coming in, and there were no footprints going back out. That was March 1922. 3 days later, 6 people would be dead. But the strangest part isn't how they died. It's what investigators believe happened after. Investigators believed someone remained on the farm after the murders. The animals had been fed, food had been consumed, the fire had been maintained, so neighbors would think the family was still alive. For 4 days, the farm functioned as though nothing had happened. And when the neighbors finally entered the barn on April 4th, they found the bodies, stacked on top of each other. 6 people, 1 weapon, and 1 fact about a child that investigators would never forget. This is Vanished Threads. More than a century later, nobody can say who walked to that farm, or why they never walked away. Hinterkaifeck was a small farmstead in rural Bavaria, about 70 kilometers north of Munich. In 1922, it was home to Andreas Gruber, his wife Cecilia, their daughter Victoria, Victoria's 2 children, 7-year-old Cecilia and 2-year-old Joseph, and a maid named Maria Baumgartner, who had arrived that very morning. The murders made headlines across Germany. Newspapers called it the worst crime in Bavarian history. Over 100 suspects were investigated. The case was officially closed in 1955, reopened in 1986, and reviewed again in 2007 by students at the Fürstenfeldbruck Police Academy. The 2007 review applied modern criminological methods to what remained of the evidence. The students reportedly narrowed the field to a probable suspect, but they never named the person, out of respect for living descendants. Their conclusion: the case cannot be definitively solved. But they had formed a theory, and we don't know whose name was on it. Here's what makes this case different from every other cold case we've covered. Modern forensic methods might have provided evidence that was unavailable to investigators in 1922, but the physical evidence needed for such testing was not preserved. The crime scene was contaminated by neighbors before investigators arrived. The farm was demolished in 1923. The victims' skulls, sent to Munich for study, were lost during World War II. The biological evidence has degraded beyond recovery. This is not just a mystery. It is a case study in what happens when institutional failure removes the possibility of closure. The Gruber household was isolated, geographically and socially. Andreas Gruber was 63, a farmer with a reputation for being difficult. His wife, Cecilia, was 72. Their daughter, Victoria, was 35, a widow. Her husband, Karl, had been reported killed in action during World War I. His body was never recovered. The family was gossiped about, kept at a distance. Andreas had even been convicted of incest with his daughter. They were not a family that the village embraced. And then there was young Cecilia, 7 years old. The age when most children are learning to read, running through fields, believing the world is safe. On the morning of March 31st, 1922, she went to school. She came home, and sometime that evening she was lured into the barn. Joseph was 2, still in diapers, still learning words. He was found bludgeoned to death in his crib. Maria Baumgartner was 44. She had arrived at Hinterkaifeck that very morning to begin work as the new maid. The previous maid had quit. She told people the house was haunted. She said she heard noises from the attic, footsteps, voices. She wouldn't stay. For months, the family had reported strange sounds from the attic. A newspaper was found on the property that no one had ordered. Several keys to outbuildings had gone missing. Andreas had told his neighbor about the footprints in the snow leading to the farm, but never away. Think about that. Someone walked to the farm and never walked back. The snow was undisturbed except for those incoming tracks. Andreas checked the attic. He found nothing, or at least nothing he reported. On the evening of March 31st, the family ate dinner. The children were put to bed. Maria Baumgartner settled into her room. It was a quiet night on an isolated farm in rural Bavaria. At some point that night, 5 members of the family were lured, one by one, into the barn. The killer used a mattock, a pickaxe-like farm tool. The blows were precise, brutal. The victims were stacked on top of each other. And then, the detail that separates this case from nearly every other mass murder in documented history, the killer reportedly stayed. The medical examiner, Dr. Johann Baptist Ullmüller, performed the autopsies inside the barn on April 5th, the day after the bodies were discovered. He determined that a mattock was the murder weapon. The blows were consistent, deliberate. This was not rage. This was execution. All 6 victims were killed with the same weapon. But the killer's behavior after the murders made no sense. The animals were fed. The bread was eaten. Fresh meat was cut from the pantry. The fire was kept burning. For 4 to 5 days, the farm functioned as though nothing had happened. Today, many investigators believe the killer was someone who knew the family intimately. Someone with a grievance. Someone who had been watching, waiting, planning. But when the Munich investigative team arrived, led by Inspector Georg Reingruber, they found a crime scene that had been contaminated beyond recovery. Neighbors had moved the bodies, cooked meals in the kitchen, walked through the barn. Whatever evidence existed, footprints, fingerprints, fibers, was destroyed before a single investigator could document it. The investigation began with 100 suspects: traveling craftsmen, vagrants, neighbors, relatives, former lovers of Victoria. The Gump brothers, linked to a paramilitary group. Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a neighbor who had been romantically involved with Victoria, who was rumored to be the father of little Joseph, and who had fought with Andreas Gruber over alimony payments. Even Karl Gabriel, Victoria's supposedly dead husband, whose body was never recovered from the war. Robbery was ruled out immediately. A large sum of money was found untouched in the house. The motive wasn't financial, it was personal. But personal to whom? The case consumed Germany. Newspapers covered every development. Clairvoyants were consulted. The skulls were removed and sent to Munich for examination. They were later lost in World War II. The farm itself was demolished in 1923, just 1 year after the murders. The investigation ran formally until 1955. It was reopened in 1986. Detective Chief Superintendent Konrad Müller-Thumann conducted the last interrogations before retiring. Nothing, no arrest, no charge, no confession. Then, in 2007, 15 students at the Fürstenfeldbruck Police Academy took on Hinterkaifeck as a cold case study. They had access to modern criminological methods. They reviewed what remained of the evidence, and they reached a conclusion that made headlines across Germany. They reportedly narrowed the field to a probable suspect, but they refused to name the person. Out of respect for living descendants, they said. The case cannot be definitively solved, they concluded. But they had formed a theory, and we don't know whose name was on it. Here's what haunts me. The 2007 review had enough evidence to form a theory, but not enough to prove it. That gap between theory and proof is what forensic science exists to close. And in this case, the evidence required to close it no longer exists. The farm is gone, the skulls are gone. The DNA has degraded beyond recovery. Investigative genetic genealogy, the technique that identified the Golden State Killer, that has solved hundreds of criminal cases, requires viable biological material. Hinterkaifeck may have none. The case is not merely unsolved, it may be unsolvable. Dr. Ullmüller's autopsy findings tell a story of methodical brutality. Andreas Gruber, severe head trauma, cheekbones protruding, face described as smashed. Casilia Gruber, multiple blows to the head. Victoria Gabriel, strangled, then bludgeoned, her skull shattered. Young Casilia, blow to the head. But the autopsy revealed she had been alive for hours afterward. Tufts of her own hair were found clutched in her hands. She had torn them out in agony, in the straw, in the dark, alone. Every clue tells a different part of the story. Some evidence is firmly documented: the murder weapon, the 6 victims, the untouched money, and the way the bodies were arranged. Other details come from witnesses: footprints in the snow, strange noises in the attic, smoke from the oven, and figures seen near the forest. And then there are the theories. Did the killer know the family? Did he remain on the farm for several days? And why were the keys missing? The evidence is real, but what it means remains uncertain. One of the most troubling contradictions. Investigators initially believed the victims were lured to the barn by noises from restless animals. But when they tested this theory, they discovered that noise from the barn could not be heard from the house. So, how were 5 people lured there, one by one, without raising alarm? At 3 a.m. on April 1st, the night of the murders, a farmer named Simon Reislender saw 2 mysterious figures standing at the edge of the forest near Hinterkaifeck. When they saw him, they turned away so their faces couldn't be seen. 2 figures, not one. The following night, an artisan named Michael Plockel passed by Hinterkaifeck. He saw smoke from the oven. An occupant of the house approached him and blinded him with a lantern. Plockel noticed the smoke had a revolting smell. This report was never investigated. No examination of the oven was conducted. What was burned in that oven? Clothes? Evidence? Bodies? We'll never know. The opportunity to examine it was lost in 1922, and the farm was demolished the following year. In May 1927, 5 years after the murders, a stranger stopped a resident of Weidhofen at midnight. He asked questions about the murders. Then he loudly identified himself as the murderer and ran into the forest. He was never identified. Was this a confession? A prank? The actual killer, tormented by guilt? The evidence failed in layers. April 1922, crime scene contaminated by neighbors. 1923, farm demolished. World War II, skulls lost. Decades following, biological samples degraded. Each layer of destruction removed another chance at resolution. This is not a case that modern science cannot solve. It is a case that modern science was never given the chance to solve. Investigative genetic genealogy has solved hundreds of murders from the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s. Not because those killers were less careful, but because the evidence was preserved. Hinterkaifeck is the cautionary version of that argument. What it looks like when the evidence is gone before the technique arrives. The 2007 review reportedly identified a probable suspect. But without DNA, without the crime scene, without the skulls, there is no bridge between suspicion and proof. The gap that forensic science exists to close remains open. Perhaps forever. Carl Gabriel was Victoria's husband, reported killed in action in France during World War I. His body was never recovered. The theory: Carl survived. He deserted. He returned to Hinterkaifeck to find his wife living with her father, and rumors of incest. He killed them all in revenge. Evidence for no body. Desertion was common in the final years of World War I. The murders were personal, methodical, consistent with a grievance. Evidence against: no confirmed sighting of Carl after 1917. No documentation of his return. The 2007 review did not reportedly identify him as the probable suspect. Assessment: speculative, plausible but unprovable. Adolf and Anton Gump were brothers with ties to the paramilitary group. Their sister reportedly accused them on her deathbed. Anton was briefly remanded but released. Adolf died in 1944. Evidence for: a deathbed accusation from their own sister. Paramilitary background suggests capacity for violence. Evidence against: no physical evidence linking them to the scene. The 2007 review did not identify them as the probable suspect. The sister's accusation may have been based on family grievance rather than fact. Assessment: weak. Lorenz Schlittenbauer was a neighbor who had been romantically involved with Victoria. He was rumored to be the biological father of little Joseph. He had fought with Andreas Gruber over alimony payments, and he was among the first to discover the bodies. placing him unusually close to the crime scene from the beginning. Evidence 4. He knew the farm's layout intimately. He had motive, financial dispute, paternity rumors, rejected relationship. He discovered the bodies alongside neighbors Michael Poll and Jacob Seil. He reportedly moved bodies before police arrived, contaminating the scene. Case historians widely consider him the subject of the 2007 Furstenfeldbruck Review. Evidence against. No physical evidence directly linking him to the murders. He cooperated with investigators, no confession. The 2007 review reportedly identified a probable suspect, but did not publicly confirm it was Schlittenbauer. Assessment: strongest documented candidate, but still not proven. In 2007, 15 students at the Furstenfeldbruck Police Academy reviewed the case. They narrowed the field to one suspect. They never named them. The review concluded definitive proof was impossible after 80 years. What does the evidence allow us to say? Schlittenbauer had motive and opportunity, but the gap remains. Behind every mystery are people who never got answers. The Gruber family was buried, without their heads, in a plot in Weidhofen. The skulls that might have yielded DNA were lost in the chaos of World War II. The farm where they died was demolished just 1 year later. Their story became a legend, but they were real people. A 7-year-old girl who tore her own hair out while dying. A 2-year-old bludgeoned in his crib. A maid who arrived for her first day of work and never left. Perhaps the most unsettling fact isn't that 6 people died on a remote Bavarian farm. It's that after more than a century of investigations, after 100 suspects, after modern criminological review, we cannot say with certainty who walked to that farm on March 31st, 1922, or why they never walked away. If Hinterkaifeck haunts you, which theory do you believe? Carl Gabriel, the dead husband who may have survived? The Gump brothers, accused by their own sister? Or Schlittenbauer, the neighbor with motive, opportunity, and the 2007 review behind him? Drop your theory below. I read every single one. The best one goes in next week's community post. Vanished threads. Some stories stay buried. We dig anyway.